The month of October is filled with the odd and macabre, supernatural, and just plain freaky things to no end. And we're only halfway through the month. Enjoy. My friend was driving without his glasses on in the middle of backcountry Maine one night. For those who have never been, you drive hours without seeing civilization, just trees and trees. He was in a daze when he saw something up ahead in the street. He stopped, couldn't quite make it out. It was moving, but very slowly. He got curious, moved real close to it in his truck. Is that a baby? Sure enough, it was a baby. He gets out of the truck, stunned. Surely this baby is abandoned. Walks over to it, goes to pick it up. It's a baby doll, being dragged slowly by a string. He got out of there as fast as he could. A couple of years ago, I was out for a run with my dog. Over the fields behind my house, we came across this old abandoned mansion. Looked like it hadn't been lived in at least 15, maybe 20 years. The guy who owned it went bankrupt, and now the bank owned the house. I decided I'd take a look through the house. It was pretty cool. Run down, but it looked like someone had left in a hurry. Eventually I head home, get back, take a shower. Afterward, I walk into my kitchen and start to make a sandwich. I bring it over to the table, and there it is, a Postit note that says, "You come into my house, I come into your house." Naturally, I freaked the fuck out, got my dog, got out of my house, phoned my parents who passed it on to the police. They said it was likely squatters and some guy had followed me home, but it was nothing to worry about. That was the last we heard about it. But no way I'm ever going back to that house. As kids, my cousin had an imaginary friend. He called him Vegeta. We never got around to how it was actually spelled, so I spelled it the way he pronounced it. He claimed that his Vegeta was a monster, but he was a nice monster, and he would occasionally tell him to do things. After a few weeks of this, he was told to never talk of Vegeta again. Apparently, this name was strikingly close to Beelzebub, so his mother put a stop to that. Now the creepy part. I was telling my friend of this story. It was dusk, and we were in the car, parked, but the car was on. As I told the story, the internal lights on the car came on, as if the door was open. Both of our phones simultaneously went haywire. She forced me to stop talking about it after that, and to never mention it again. It's crazy, but funny enough that people always think I'm making this up, despite being able to cross-reference with 2 other people. When I was a kid, my brother and I used to visit our cousins 3 hours away. One time, our parents went out and left my brother and I with my 2 cousins. The older cousin had something else to do, and so the 3 of us, being between 10 and 13 years old, were on our own. For one reason or another, we were in my aunt and uncle's bedroom when I looked into the living room, and clear as day, saw a pair of my uncle's disembodied dress slacks dancing away in the living room. Obviously, I freaked out, called my cousin and brother over, and all 3 of us witnessed it. There's no way it could have been a prank because the legs were moving and dancing and everything. There was too much dexterity for them to be controlled by a prankster. To this day, all 3 of us can collaborate this story. My cousin, who is now a missionary, even swears it happened, despite the fact that it's far outside the realm of her beliefs. When we talk about it, she just takes a breath and says, "Yeah, I remember those dancing pants." I was in Mexico with some of my cousins, and we decided to start a bonfire outside an abandoned warehouse that was down the road from our family's ranch. Reaching nightfall, we got the fire going and settled down around it. We talked and laughed and whatnot, until one of my cousins noticed an odd human-like figure standing in a distance. This person or thing was wearing a blackened, dirty white gown with their hair over their face looking down. We all stood up and got behind the oldest cousin. I remember asking who they were and what they wanted. The fact that it wasn't responding got us uneasy. Shortly afterward, it started to glide toward us. My blood shot cold seeing that. We were in disbelief and frozen. Once we snapped out of it, we started running and screaming back to the ranch. No one knew what that was, and never went back there at night again. I did IT work for a gun range that rented out guns for you to use on the range. As you might expect, there were quite a few squirrely, don't tread on me types in there at any given time, so I always paid close attention to what was going on in there. There were windows into the range, so you could see who was shooting. One day I noticed a lady in there loading up, who I hadn't seen come in. I rebuked myself for my lack of vigilance and went about my business. It happened again a couple weeks later, and I resolved to keep an eye on the range. But she got out of there without me noticing somehow. This pattern repeated several times over the following weeks, until I finally heard about the lady that had come in a few years back, rented a gun, walked into the range, and shot herself in the head. I noped the fuck out of that job. This happened to my uncle before he married my aunt and became part of our family. He lived with his previous wife and kids in a house for most of their lives, and his wife suddenly became terminally ill and died a few months later. Throughout her entire life, she was a very kind person, but she hated the green curtains in her living room more than anything else. She would apologize about them when guests came over, talked about how much she hated them whenever they went to home improvement stores, and tried to keep them out of view as much as possible. I'm not sure why she or my uncle never got around to changing them. Could have been financial problems, distractions, couldn't find ones they liked, etc. But they never did. The curtains remained. The night she died, my uncle and his kids spent the night with her in the hospital and returned home the next morning. They said after being in the house in silence for about an hour, those green curtains came crashing to the ground. My uncle and cousins didn't know whether to be absolutely terrified or laugh. They immediately threw them in the garbage and later picked out new ones they thought she would like. I have no doubt that she took it upon herself to finally get rid of those curtains. I moved to Huntsville about 5 years ago. Here in Texas, Huntsville holds the state prison, so it's creepy just for that. Alongside the prison, very old houses remain. I dated a guy for about a year and he lived in the row of old houses right off campus. He lived at the end of the row in a house built in the 20s. Every day as I walked down to his house, I passed a gorgeous white house that was built in the 1800s. Tall, 3 stories, and sat on top of a hill. It was torn up and had no windows or doors, but I always found it fascinating and haunting at the same time. I hoped one day the boarded up doors and windows would be open so I could go explore. one day, I got my chance. The board was cracked open, and we went right on in. Creeping in from room to room, everything was boards and nails and completely deserted and falling apart. But creepy enough, the only thing that remained in any of the rooms were the clawfoot tubs. There were 2 downstairs, and they were beautiful. I almost fell through a couple of holes, but I managed to make it up to the 3rd floor. Again, a clawfoot tub sat deserted in the hallway. I made my way around and landed in the final of the 15 rooms, top left corner. It looked out onto the street and had a staircase that led to the attic. As soon as I walked into the space, mind you, there are no doors, I knew I had to leave. I can't explain it, but it became unusually cold for the Texas weather. The hair on my neck stood up. I felt like I needed to run, and I did. Right back down the hall, passing all the creepy tubs and out the door. I didn't return. Fast forward about 3 weeks, I came across a Huntsville ghost hunting book, which included houses from around town. I read it happily, until I came across a story about that white house. According to the previous owner, the house used to be a morgue. The clawfoot tubs were the original tubs they used to drain the dead bodies in before they prepared them. And it said sometimes people saw a figure of a man who was supposed to be the original owner in the windowless window in the top left corner room looking out onto the street. A few years ago, I lived in a little cottage-style house that was built in the 20s. It was a charming house and I loved it. But weird things happened in that house. The first things we noticed were that we couldn't place anything made of glass on the counters in the kitchen and turn our backs, because they would fall to the ground instantly and shatter. I tried putting the glasses on the backside of the countertop against the wall, but they would still somehow fall off and break as soon as I left the room. From the first month we moved in, I would hear vomiting noises, coughing and sobbing coming from the bathroom. My roommate had stomach issues, and no one would answer when I asked if everything was okay. So I just assumed it was her and that she wanted to be left alone. This went on weekly for 10 months. One day, my roommate and I were hanging out and she asked if I was feeling okay. I told her yes, I was feeling fine. Why? I heard you throwing up earlier this morning and I was worried about you. Why were you crying? I said I thought it was her. We stared at each other, realizing we were the only ones home that entire week. We then realized that we both thought the other person had been sick and crying in the bathroom for the entire year, but it was neither of us. So if you hear a bump in the night, see a shadow from the corner of your eye, will you run? Will you brush it off as something completely logical? Or will we be hearing about you next? Careful out there, kids. The boogeyman is apparently everywhere. See you next time